Well, thank you for inviting us to talk today. So I'm Naomi, I'm joined by colleagues, Clareece and Janion, and as I said, we'd a bit about our story of academics moving into the field of developing apps. And although you've got three of us here today, this project that we're going to talk about is part of a much bigger group. So this is all of the people who've worked on the apps or on the project at various times, various roles. And I'd also just like to thank our funders at this point as well.
Cool, so the CRSU was formed in 2015. It was a collaboration between University of Leicester, University of Glasgow and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And they basically had the aim to provide flexible, timely and appropriate support for the delivery of complex reviews. And if you don't know what a complex review is, that's fine, it's basically a stats thing, but I'm going to try and keep it very, very low on the stats because we're not a stats conference. The key thing to know is that sometimes when researchers, particularly medical researchers, if they want to answer a question, instead of doing one single study, they may actually decide to gather all the studies that are currently done in the literature, gather them all together and analyse them. And then that is called a review. Is that me or you? And then that is what's called a systematic review, or just a review for now. It's over there. So then you may be thinking, well, what's a complex review? And that's basically where, just to answer certain questions, sometimes the analysis just needs to be a bit more complex. But if you are interested in the statistics, it includes these kinds of statistical models. But the key thing to know is that members of the CRSU, they were experts in this field. And so that meant we could come and support and advise other research groups and enable them to answer those questions. But as we were supporting these groups, we were realising that all the classic statistical programs they were using, they were really struggling with it. And so that led to the second aim, to contribute to building capacity and capability within the research community. And this basically just looked like, so that when we support these groups, it meant that we could actually leave them and not hold their hand anymore, and they could get on and continue to do these complex analyses themselves. And so to do that, we decided we would look into seeing if there were any good tools out there, or maybe even create some tools. And so when creating these tools, straight away we had some key principles to look for. One, the tools should never replace a statistician. You still need a statistician to understand what's going on, like under the hood of things, actually being able to interpret these things. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. There's loads of great R packages out there that do all these complex analyses. We just wanted to make a way that other researchers could use those that were struggling to. And finally, we wanted these tools to be free to use, open source, and an easy to use interface.
So just going back to sort of the beginning of this project, we're talking about 2017-ish. It's a bit echoey. So I think I'm having mic issues. So this project started in about 2017. Both Clareece and myself separately did 3-month mini projects. So my mini project was looking at implementing a particular analysis called network meta-analysis within an app. At the time, I had been programming in R for a few months, less than a year. I'd never programmed in Shiny before. So although it was about implementing the analysis, a lot of it for me was actually learning how to use Shiny. So I had 3 months on the project. I created this app at the end of it. I was very pleased. I got something that worked. I wrote it up as I needed to do for my project. I put this up on my personal Shiny Apps account where it still lives, hence being able to get a screenshot of it so I could put it on my CV. And I went off to my next project and thought that that was kind of the end of it.
But it wasn't. Like we say, these were just 3-month projects, both for our studies, but the CRSU, they kind of really liked them, thought they were really good proof of concept, so they basically adopted them. And that was basically, they added some more features. They meant that adding user input of their own data rather than using example data sets, adding in some further statistical options, further features, and generally just tidying up the apps so that, you know, they would actually be nice to look at and nice to use for people to use. And that led to some publications in 2019, one for each of the apps that we initially worked on. Because we're academics, we love to do a paper. And so that was around 2019. So in those few years around then, we were basically just spreading the word that, hey guys, we got these apps. It'd be great for you to use them. And we did that like through conferences. And yeah, we were just spreading the word.
And so as a result of doing this, having the papers out, having the workshops, everything sort of exploded, which was great. We wanted people to start using our apps, and they did start using our apps. We put Google Analytics in them so that we saw that they were being used all across the world. People contacted us letting us know that they were using our apps for teaching these methods. So rather than people having to do all the coding themselves in R, they could use the point and click interface. We started to see publications were citing us, so they were using our apps to do the analysis, to save them writing all the code, getting their analyses published, and then obviously citing our publications. But I think the thing that we didn't quite foresee was the user queries that started coming in. And obviously, as more people, as the apps were out in the real world, real people were using the apps, obviously we were getting queries, questions asking us about issues that were coming up with the apps.
Some of these questions were quite simple. Some of them actually meant we had to do things to our apps to actually fix it. It wasn't just a simple, oh, you're doing it wrong. It was actually something in our apps needed to change. An example of this, this is in one of our apps. This is a standard output for network meta-analysis. You don't need to understand what's going on, but you can see it's a nice plot. Everything's lined up nicely. And this is using one of the inbuilt data sets. So then we had a group come and email us, and they said that when they put their data in, it looked like that, which you'll all agree isn't really readable. And it was basically there's too much going on, and it's because the plot was a fixed size. So we realized we needed to make it reactive to the amount of treatments that were in there. So we did that, and then that meant that once we did that fix to the app, it was then readable. Like, it's quite, you can't see it all there because they did have a lot of treatments in their analysis, but at least you could read it, and it was up to them to decide what to do with it. And it was that sort of cycle of people emailing us and realizing, oh, okay, we need to tweak the apps a bit more. That cycle made us realize just how many people were using it and how much they were being relied upon. And we soon realized that we weren't just making tools to aid researchers, but we were actually developing and maintaining software for people. So the rest of this talk is kind of looking at that shift and, yeah, what was the experiences that we were finding. So even though we're in 2023, you can't be at any conference without hearing about COVID, so I'm going to give you that. So during COVID, lots and lots of research came out, and this led to a lot of what's called a living review. Basically, instead of just at one time point searching for all your studies and then reporting it, you will continuously look for those studies and continuously include them in your review. And this was really, really suitable for COVID, and so many living reviews were happening. But there was never what was called a living network meta-analysis, which is when you've got multiple treatments, and so that would be really good for COVID. But we were like, we have an app, Meta Insight, that basically automates network meta-analysis. So what about a living NMA? So we did a feasibility study. We made like a tailored version of Meta Insight called COVID-19. And we basically just plugged in the data from one of these living reviews into it. And what that looked like practically was we created a Google spreadsheet that we, anytime that living review added some more studies into it, we put it into the Google spreadsheet, and that was linked with the Shiny app so that it automatically updated the results. We didn't have to redeploy anything, it just automatically did it. And so that was really good. We ran this study for about 4 months, and we updated it weekly. However, we were updating it manually, which is never fun. And it was particularly not fun because the data was only accessible in images like this. So as well as that being difficult, as time went on, it was difficult to also see which studies were actually new. So we needed some help with automating this process.
It was effectively just one big spot the difference, but a lot less fun, a lot more complicated. So at this time, I was one of the lucky ones who had a lot more free time on my hands. And I knew of the team, so I offered to help out as an independent software engineer. So I started poking around on the website where we were getting those forest plot images and found, great, easily accessible as file archive. So I suggested that we write a Python script that would run once a week on a Raspberry Pi. It would go to the website, download all of the images. It would use the metadata to work out which of those images had changed in the last week. Then it would highlight on those images which parts have actually changed, and then email that off to a statistician. And we did experiment with optical character recognition, but the images that we had access to were just a little bit too inconsistent for that. And here's a really good example where there's a lot of data on here, but you can see just a few bits have been highlighted. And that meant that it reduced the workload for the statistician by about 90%. Pretty good result. And this was the first time that we'd had a software engineer on the team. And I think this is when it started to dawn on the wider team the benefit of having that more diverse skill set available.
So, like I said earlier, I initially was involved in this project on a 3-month mini project right at the beginning. And I went away and did some other very exciting work. And then I was fortunate enough to come back in 2022 and join the CRFU again. And my app that I had left after my 3-month mini project, I came back and it had morphed into this, which is the current version of our app that we have at the moment. And the apps had moved on a lot. There was a lot more content in them. We had not just this app, but we've got a suite of about 4 or 5 different apps. And coming back, it was quite a good experience to kind of have fresh eyes on the projects, I think. And I realised that it was quite difficult coming back, or coming in new, essentially, and starting to try and work with the code, and realised that we did need to make changes. But also realising that I didn't necessarily have the right skills, or we didn't necessarily have the right skills as a group at the time. Fortunately, we did have a bit of money left in our grant, so we were able to employ some new people. So we've got quite a big group at the moment, and we've got quite a diverse team now. So whereas it started out very much like statisticians who just had an interest in writing shiny apps, we've obviously now got people like Janion, who's much more of a software engineer with less knowledge about the statistics side. And then we've got, I'd probably put myself in the middle, perhaps I call myself a health data scientist now, with a bit of knowledge from a lot of different disciplines. But it works really well now as a team in that we can share all of our knowledge and try and improve the way that we work. And when we started working on the apps, and when we got our first publications, literally all we did was we put a link in our article to the apps. We didn't even have the source code up on GitHub at the time. Obviously, we now do have the code up on GitHub, so that's available. And I think that that's kind of moved on in sort of academic publishing in the last few years. But then in our most recent publication, we are now getting a lot more pushback from our reviewers, which is a good thing. So our most recent review was asking us things like, are we using testing, which we weren't, and are we paying any attention to like the FAIR principles that I always forget the name of. And so we've got, as well as having this sort of internal drive to improve, there's also external pressures to improve.
So as we've heard, when these apps were first created, they weren't really expected to live on much past their original publication date. And so that meant that a lot of features were just kind of built on top of what was already there without a lot of thought into the overall structure. So it kind of looked a bit like this, just everything just plonked on top of each other. And wasn't really paying attention to new technologies which would make life easier as well. So everything worked, but it could have been a bit smoother. So I came on earlier this year specifically as a software engineer, not as a statistician. And my mandate effectively was to improve the maintainability of our code bases. And that has meant doing things like implementing some best practices, development best practices within the teams, codifying some of the existing workflows that we had, and just generally going through the existing code base and improving the documentation and things like that. So I want to talk about a few things that I've focused on in the past few months. First one being modules. So when we first started developing apps, it keeps going. Modules were still quite new and I think not very widely adopted yet, particularly in these academic environments. And so yeah, here is one of our apps, the entire app in one file, 10,000 lines long. New code now is written in modules. Yes. And I've put together some training resources that we're using within our team to help people to learn how to use those. And the plan, the hope, is to go back and modularize a lot of the code base that we currently have as we get time. Another thing is testing. Naomi already mentioned that we've been picked up on this now. And when I started, we didn't have any tests whatsoever. We now have some unit tests, yes. And new code, again, is being tested as we write it, and we're trying to keep on top of that. And we're hoping that some of the stuff that came out of yesterday's workshop on testing, we can implement that as well. Also, what we want to get is some continuous integration stuff going, so we can get our tests to be run automatically on commits or maybe pull requests, whichever is most relevant. And finally, the one thing I want to focus on is design. So we now use Jira to manage our tasks. And the first part of that workflow is to create a design. And that's a bit of a change from traditional academia, which is maybe not quite blue sky research, but there is a bit of sort of indirect exploration or undirected exploration. Whereas now, when we're making software, the focus is a bit different. We now have really concrete goals, and we need to know how we get there. And it's got a lot of benefits. So things like spreading knowledge among the team. So if a reviewer sees the design and goes, actually, I know a better way of doing that, they can teach the developer that way. But also, it's just a second set of eyes to pick up on any edge cases or making sure that we're not coding ourselves into a corner and blocking future developments.
So looking at some of the lessons that we've learned, particularly focusing on making production grade apps. Firstly, this is quite personal to Naomi and myself, is that prototypes inevitably become production. We didn't think that our apps would become the base of these apps that are used around the world. And I think knowing that now, I think there are two things in that. Firstly, I think we would have changed our priorities, maybe thought more about the user interface rather than seeing how much we can just squeeze into this app to show our lecturers how good we are. And then another one, which I think is a bigger thing, is I think we would have done less workarounds. We only had 3 months, and like I said, you wanted to fit in as much as possible. And some of the things that we did, we knew they weren't the best options, but they were just the only way we could get them in the time. One example of this, and no shame on Naomi at all, putting the treatment labels in just to get it done in time. This was done using, I think, just a text input. So you just had to type it in, and it had to be tabs and everything. That stayed in there for quite a few years. It was actually the cause of quite a few user queries. And we recently changed it, and funnily enough, our user queries have actually reduced. And it just shows, yeah, if we'd known that, we maybe wouldn't have designed it quite like that. And this leads quite nicely to our second lesson, which is basically don't be the kind of person that goes, yay, it works, I'm never going to touch it ever again. It leads to things not being optimal. We need to make sure we look at our apps again with some fresh eyes, really question why are we doing these things. Maybe get somebody else to look at the app, because they will question, like, why did you name it like that? And sometimes we're like, not really sure, just it seemed all right at the time. And that includes looking at packages and whether they've had updates. We've certainly had this. You use a package, you're like, great. Check if those packages have been updated and whether any of those updates actually help you with any limitations that are currently going on in the apps.
So the next lesson that we want to focus on is kind of one of the eternal struggles of software development. And that is striking the balance between new features and maintenance. And I think this is particularly difficult in academia because, as we've heard, academics love papers. And that means new features because journals really want novel approaches. And maintenance, even if it's a big overhaul of a system, just isn't of interest to their readers. There are a few organizations that are making progress on this front. So for instance, the Society of Research Software Engineering, they're doing great work talking to academic institutions, convincing them of the value provided by research software and finding ways of recognizing it. And there are a few institutions that are providing actual ways of recognizing it. So one of those being the Journal for Open Source Software, and another one being the Software Sustainability Institute. Our recommendation on this front is simple, really. It's just to check in with your team early on in a project and see where their focus is and where their priorities are. Because you'll have people who want to go more towards maintenance and more towards features. And this is still an ongoing debate within our team, but I think we've struck a pretty good balance that works for individuals. And again, it's worth just checking in quite regularly with your team members because priorities change and people might want to move. And our final recommendation, or lesson learned, is to get a software engineer on board early. So a lot of our user queries over the years have been from people who want to do these complex statistical analyses. And they email us asking for help, saying, I've got this, can you help me interpret it? Or I'm not quite sure what to do with this aspect of it. And we always go back and say, what you really need to do is get a statistician on board early, because they'll help you to design your study and also to interpret it and prevent simple mistakes, but potentially misleading results as well. The irony of our journey is that our team didn't realize the value of getting a software engineer on board until quite late in the game. So our recommendation is that teams who are making even just tools that they don't consider to be software, they should at least consult with a software engineer pretty early on, just to make sure that you're building on good foundations and using some best practices.
So where do we go from here? As you've heard, we're in a nice place at the moment where we've got a really good group together. Unfortunately, our funding runs out at the end of November. So we are trying to get some more funding. Anyone who's worked in academia will probably be familiar with this problem. We still have plenty of ideas for new features, both within our apps, and we also have at least one app in the pipeline. And then sort of continuing to develop our working practices. Another big thing that we're looking at is we're currently hosting our apps on Shiny Apps, and there's concerns about whether that's sort of the best way to do things long term and to ensure the longevity of the apps being available.
So in conclusion, we hope that the experiences that we've had, that we've shared today, can help other people to make really great software and great tools in these sort of non-traditional software environments. And if any of you are in or have been in similar teams and you've got some insights that we've missed, we'd love to chat to you afterwards. Also, if you're in a team where you're sort of starting this journey, where you're in a similar position to us sort of 5 or 6 years ago, again, we'd love to chat to you in the breaks. Do come and find us. So thank you for listening.